Aristotle never treats excellence as something we simply arrive at. The way he sees it, we never really have it. We are only ever in the process of doing it and acquiring it. And he means this literally, not as a motivational line about life is all about the journey, but as a claim about what excellence actually is. Arete isn't a condition. Arete is an activity. And the moment the activity stops, the excellence is gone. There's no version of a well-formed character that just sustains itself indefinitely. And there's no point at which the work of becoming excellence is finished, and we get to keep what we have built. Now, the word arete gets translated in many different ways. Some call it excellence, some call it virtue, and some call it the fullness of a thing's function. But what Aristotle actually means by arete is a bit more specific than any of these translations allude to. And in order to understand what he actually means, we need to start where he starts, which is with the Ergon argument in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And the argument goes something like this. For most things we recognize, what makes them good is how well they do what they are actually for. A good knife cuts well, a good eye sees well, and a good physician produces health reliably in his patients. In each case, the excellence of the thing comes down to how well it actually performs the activity that belongs to it and not to something else. And Aristotle wants to apply this exact same logic to the human being. So the question he asks is, what is the characteristic activity of a human being? So he first rules out mere life, because we share that with plants. He then also rules out sentient life, because we share that with animals. What's left, and what he takes to be distinctively human, is the active exercise of the soul's faculty in accordance with rational principle. And he isn't just saying that humans are rational, so the good life automatically means being rational. What he's actually saying is that the human good is the active exercise of that rational faculty. Being excellent in this sense is not just having the capacity. Being excellent means actually exercising it. This distinction between having a capacity and actually putting this capacity into work is what the whole Ergon argument actually builds on. In other words, what makes a human life flourish is the excellent performance of this activity. Arete is what allows us to perform it well. Arete isn't a product the activity aims at. It isn't something that comes before the activity and makes the activity possible in the first place. Arete is a quality of the activity itself. It is the way we are actually carrying out what's characteristically good for a human being. And Aristotle goes even further. He draws a distinction between two kinds of activities, which are kinesis and energia. Kinesis is an activity that moves towards an end that is outside itself. It is only complete when the end is reached. Building a house is kinesis, because the house isn't finished until the house actually exists. Learning a language is kinesis, because the process of learning isn't complete until the competence of mastering language is actually built. But energia is completely different. Energia is complete at the very moment of its exercise. For example, when we see something, we have seen it, we don't finish seeing it. And when we understand something, the understanding itself is present as it is actually occurring. These activities, they aren't incomplete versions of something that will be finished later. They're fully what they are during the exact act of them being performed. Now, Aristotle also draws a line between the virtues of character and the virtues of the intellect. The virtues of character are the ones we usually mean when we talk about virtue, so virtue in the moral sense. Courage, justice, generosity, or temperance. So basically, all of the things that shape how we respond to the situations of our own lives. On the other hand, the virtues of intellect are the excellences of thought. So, namely practical wisdom, theoretical wisdom, and of course understanding. And his account of the complete good includes both. A life of excellent character that still neglects the intellectual virtues isn't fully excellent in Aristotle's sense. And a life of great intellectual refinement without the formation of a sound character to go with it is also incomplete. And here, Aristotle uses the image of sleeping and waking to explain his ideas. So, someone who has excellent character but does nothing with this character, or someone who has every disposition toward excellence but still pulls back from the situations that would actually call on them, this kind of person is asleep. He is not awake. Because the capacity is there, yes, but what the capacity is actually for isn't being produced. In other words, having virtue isn't enough on its own. It has to be exercised. And Aristotle also makes the same point through the Olympic Games. The prizes at Olympia, they don't go to the most beautiful person or the strongest person in the abstract. They go to the person who actually competes in the games and wins. Someone with every single physical gift needed for victory, but who never really enters the contest itself, hasn't yet achieved what those gifts are for, and is therefore not yet eligible for the prize. And this logic also applies to Arete. Excellence that never really meets the actual situations and demand of real life isn't fully what Arete is for. Arete needs to be tested, it needs an arena, and it needs to be tested against something real to actually be fully what it is. So the Ergon argument, if we follow it all the way through, gives us Arete as the excellent exercise of our faculties across their full range. So mainly in the activity of living a life that is genuinely engaged with the world. Arete is not a thing we can possess, it is not a state, and it is not something that we can secure and keep forever. Instead, Arete is an activity that has to be continuously exercised so that it remains real. So if Arete is an activity rather than a state we can possess, then the next question is, how do we actually develop it? And Aristotle's answer to this is habituation, though it is of course a bit more complicated than it sounds. The easy version of it is that we become just by doing just acts, and we become courageous by doing courageous acts. And that's true as far as it goes. But that is also incomplete, because these acts, they have to be the right acts from the beginning. Doing unjust acts repeatedly logically doesn't develop justice. It develops a capacity for injustice. So habituation actually requires a kind of early judgment from the start. It requires us to develop the ability to recognize what the right act actually is, which is exactly what the process of habituation is refining. Now, in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle suggests that moral education cannot begin from a position of complete neutrality. He argues that we must already possess some initial formation of character, or at least like a basic orientation toward what is noble and what is shameful, if ethical training is to take hold at all. Someone that is formed well early on in life, someone who is habituated to take genuine pleasure in the fine things and to feel discomfort at the base ones, comes to moral development with some ground to actually build on. On the other hand, someone who hasn't had that formation, this person faces a much difficult or harder task. They're basically working against patterns that are already set in their lives. And this is why Aristotle and Plato connect gymnastique to character in the way we talked about in the previous video. Physical training is one of the earliest way and one of the simplest ways we can begin to bring our responses and our appetites into order. The body is essentially the first arena in which habituation starts to work for us and on us. Now, as moral education deepens through repeated engagement with real situations, what gets developed next is Hexis, which is Aristotle's term for the stable disposition of a virtuous person. Now, Hexis isn't fixed, and it also is never finished. It's simply a reliable orientation. It is basically the kind of settled character that lets someone respond well to what situations actually demand, without thinking it through from scratch each and every time. Someone who has developed the Hexis of courage doesn't have to reason their way into the courageous act in a moment of danger, because the courage is already there and it is already being expressed through action. Hexis is always either being reinforced or worn down by the choices that we encounter in our lives. It is quote-unquote alive, and it needs some expression, so mainly our actions, to stay real. And as this Hexis develops, something else is also developing alongside it. And this is what Aristotle calls phronesis, so practical wisdom. Phronesis is what lets us see what the right act actually is in each and every situation. And it grows alongside the character that it governs, not before it and not after it. Excellent character without practical reason is unreliable. It essentially lacks the judgment to direct its self-will. And practical wisdom without excellent character is, on the other hand, just cleverness, where the capability of seeing the right course of action is there, but not yet fully disposed to execute it on it reliably. Now, besides this, in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle also tells us that the virtues arise in us, neither by nature nor against nature, but that we are adapted by nature to receive them and made perfect by our own habits. And with this, he is essentially ruling out two possibilities. The first is the idea that virtue is just natural, that some people are just born courageous, or that some people are born just, and that character formation is just the unfolding of what was already there from the very beginning. The second point, or the second claim, is the claim that virtue is entirely imposed from the outside, that it is pressed onto our nature that was either neutral or completely passive. Aristotle rejects both of these possibilities. In his view, we have the raw capacity for all of the virtues, since it is what our nature gives us. But that capacity has to be cultivated through our own actions. In other words, nature provides the fertile ground, while our habituation and actions do the sowing. Ultimately, good character is neither guaranteed nor completely impossible. We can develop genuine excellence, and we can also completely fail to develop it. The difference ultimately comes down to what we actually do over time, what we practice, what we let become habitual, and what we refuse to let settle. The habits we form, they aren't just behavioral patterns, they are the substance of who we become over time. Now, excellence in Aristotle's account is also never purely private. The way he sees it, most virtues are relational at their core. Courage is usually exercised in the face of real dangers that matter to something beyond the self. Justice is usually constituted by our dealings with other people. Generosity usually requires others who can actually receive it. And magnanimity expresses itself in how a person actually conducts themselves in relation to honor and to other people's regard. These aren't virtues we can't fully express in isolation. And someone who has these virtues but never really brings them to the outside isn't fully realizing what these virtues are actually for. Aristotle says in his Politics that the human being is by nature a political animal. The human being is a creature whose nature is only fully realized in a community. The polis isn't something we impose on an already complete human nature. It is what lets our nature to reach its full expression. And the virtues are what actually make this genuine communal life possible. The person of excellent character, this person isn't just simply flourishing in themselves. Instead, through the very expression of their excellence, they are contributing something to the people around them. Their reliability, their sense of justice, their courage, and their practical wisdom, all of these things are goods, not just for the person who has them, but for everyone that is around them. And the virtues themselves make this civic dimension unavoidable. Take courage, for example. Aristotle defines courage in Book 3 as the right disposition toward fear and confidence, specifically in the face of death in battle. And he goes to this extreme because courage at its fullest expression is the willingness to face the worst possible outcome for the sake of something that is genuinely worth this extreme cost. And what makes something worth this kind of cost, at least for Aristotle, is its connection to the common good. So, to the life of the community, which is also, to Aristotle, what makes a genuinely good life possible in the first place. For him, courage that serves only the self isn't a full virtue. It needs an object that is worthy of it, and that object is always, in some sense, larger than the person themselves. And the same is also true for justice, which Aristotle calls in Book 5 the complete virtue in relation to others. He draws a line between justice as a particular virtue, so fair exchange or equal treatment, and justice in the full sense, which is the whole of our virtue showing up in how we deal with other people. In other words, someone of genuine arete shapes the people around them. They contribute to the quality of the community positively, and what they do carries everyone forward beyond any single act. Ultimately, what we can deduce from all of what we've just talked about is a more exact picture of what arete actually is. Arete is not a finished condition that we simply arrive at and possess in the same way we can possess an object. Nor is it just a set of admirable traits that are sitting dormant in the background of the self. Instead, arete is a formed excellence of character and intellect that becomes real in activity. It is built through habituation, it is stabilized as disposition, it is guided by judgment, and it is made visible in action. The excellent person, this is not someone who has reached a final resting point that is called virtue. They are someone whose character has been shaped well enough so that in the situations of life as it actually unfolds, this kind of person tends to perceive rightly, they tend to choose rightly, and they tend to act rightly. But Aristotle also refuses the fantasy that excellence alone is sufficient in an absolute sense. In Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says plainly that flourishing also requires a certain measure of external goods. Things like friendship, or some degree of material sufficiency, and of course the freedom from utter ruin and the presence of a functioning civic world. All of these things matter. A person may be excellent in character and yet still be crushed by circumstances so severe that the full shape of eudaimonia cannot come into view. Aristotle doesn't try to solve this tension away. He accepts this tension as the truth about human life. We are rational and ethical beings, but we are also vulnerable beings, exposed to fortune and dependent in part on conditions that are outside of our control. This point matters because it keeps Aristotle's account grounded. The excellent life is not just a private inner fantasy untouched by outside circumstances. It is more so a way of living well in the world, among other people, under real conditions, and through sustained effort over time. Arete, therefore, has an inherently exposed quality to it. It must meet situations, it must be expressed in choices, it must endure contact with difficulty, with risk, with limitation, and with contingency. The person of excellence is not withdrawn from life, but actually engaged in it at the highest level their own circumstances allow. So arete should not be simply understood as a destination at the end of our own development, but as the ongoing excellence with which life is lived. It is the quality of a person who is actively realizing what is best in them through thought, choice, action, and relation.